She signed away everything she owned with a single stroke of a pen, and the person who convinced her to do it was her own daughter. Margaret Chen had spent 37 years building a life in Portland, Oregon, not the trendy downtown Portland with its food trucks and boutique coffee shops, but the quiet suburbs where dogwood trees lined the streets and neighbors still waved from their driveways. Her house, a classic craftsman with a wraparound porch, sat on 2 acres that backed up to a creek. She'd raised her daughter there, buried her husband there, in a sense, scattering his ashes under the Japanese maple they'd planted on their 20th anniversary. The house smelled like the life she'd built, lemonwood polish, the faint ghost of her husband's morning coffee ritual, fresh-cut flowers from her garden always in a vase on the kitchen table. She was 73 and had more money than she needed. Her husband had been careful, strategic. They'd invested well, lived modestly, and when he passed, he'd left her comfortable, more than comfortable. But money doesn't keep you warm at night. That's what her daughter said, Rebecca, standing in that very kitchen, her voice soft with concern. Rebecca had flown in from Phoenix with her husband Derek, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. They'd come for Thanksgiving, but the turkey had barely been carved before Rebecca started in about Margaret living alone. "Mom, what if you fall? What if something happens and no one finds you for days?" It was a reasonable fear. Margaret had slipped on black ice the previous winter, caught herself on the porch railing, felt her heart hammering for hours afterward at how close she'd come, but she'd been fine. She'd always been fine. Still, doubt is a seed, and Rebecca watered it every phone call after that. By Christmas, Margaret found herself agreeing to let them help organize her affairs. It seemed responsible. Rebecca had power of attorney paperwork drawn up, just for emergencies, she said, just so someone could make decisions if she couldn't. Derek explained the documents in that smooth, patient voice people use when they think you're not quite keeping up. Medical power of attorney, financial power of attorney, living trust modifications. Margaret signed them at her kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon in January, while freezing rain tapped against the windows. Rebecca held her hand, told her how proud she was that Margaret was being so proactive, so wise. The ink was barely dry before things started changing. First, it was small. Rebecca suggested Margaret cut back on her volunteer work at the library. Too much driving, she said, too tiring. Then it was the garden club, too much time on her knees in the dirt, bad for her joints. Margaret protested, but gently. She didn't want to seem difficult. Then Derek started appearing in her online banking portal. Joint access, Rebecca explained, just to help monitor things, make sure no one was taking advantage of her. Scams targeting seniors were everywhere after all. Margaret hadn't needed help before, but she supposed it made sense. She'd read articles about elderly people losing their life savings to phone scams, to fake IRS agents, to romance fraudsters who preyed on loneliness. By March, Rebecca was visiting every week. By April, she'd moved into the guest room. "Just for a while, Mom, just until we figure some things out." Figuring things out meant Derek flying up every other weekend. It meant hushed conversations behind closed doors. It meant Margaret waking up to find them going through her filing cabinets, her safe deposit box key, her jewelry. "We're just taking inventory," Rebecca said when Margaret asked, "making sure everything's documented, for estate planning." But Margaret was still alive, still healthy, still capable of making her own coffee every morning, still tending her roses, still reading 3 books a week, still wondering in the quiet hours before dawn when exactly she'd stopped being the one in charge of her own life. The attorney was Rebecca's choice, a man named Griffin who worked out of a glass office tower downtown and spoke in the kind of legal jargon that made Margaret's head swim. He had papers ready, so many papers, and Rebecca sat beside her the entire time, squeezing her hand, telling her it was all routine. "We're just consolidating things, Mom, making it easier to manage. You won't have to worry about bills or taxes or any of that stress anymore. We'll take care of everything." Margaret signed. She signed because Rebecca was her daughter. She signed because her hand shook lately and she was tired of pretending it didn't. She signed because some part of her wanted to believe that this was love, that this was what family did. She signed away the house, the investment accounts, the rental properties her husband had accumulated, everything. In return, she'd live comfortably. Rebecca promised. Everything she needed would be provided. What Margaret needed, apparently, was to be somewhere else. Silverdale Senior Living sat 40 minutes outside Portland, past the suburbs, past the last Starbucks, into a stretch of farmland that had been slowly converting to storage units and strip malls. The building was low and sprawling, institutional beige with narrow windows that reminded Margaret of a school she'd once taught in the 70s. Rebecca called it a transition, just until they could find the perfect place, just until Margaret adjusted to a simpler lifestyle. The room was 12 by 12, linoleum floors, a twin bed with a plastic mattress cover that crinkled when she moved, a window that looked out onto a parking lot, no kitchen, no garden, no creek running behind the house where frogs sang in the summer evenings. Rebecca hugged her goodbye, said she'd visit soon, said she'd call every day. She didn't. The facility operated on efficiency, meals at set times, delivered on plastic trays by rotating staff who barely made eye contact, activities in a common room that smelled like industrial cleaner and despair, bingo on Tuesdays, a movie on Fridays, and a visit from a church group that sang old hymns off-key. Margaret stopped asking when Rebecca would visit, stopped calling because her cell phone had been misplaced during the move and the facility's phone required a code she could never remember, stopped trying to leave because the front doors locked from the outside and she wasn't sure where she'd go anyway. The house was gone, her car was gone, her autonomy had evaporated like morning mist. The pills multiplied. For anxiety, they said, for sleep, for the agitation she displayed when she asked too many questions about her accounts, about her property, about why Rebecca never answered her calls. Margaret took them because refusing meant being labeled difficult, combative, a danger to herself. The pills made the days soft around the edges, made time feel like something happening to someone else. She'd sit in the common room watching game shows she didn't follow, or lie in her narrow bed counting the acoustic tiles on the ceiling. 64, always 64. Her hair, once a silver she'd been proud of, grew dull and limp. Her clothes hung looser. The garden club ladies would barely recognize her. Her library friends would be horrified. But none of them knew where she was. Rebecca handled the transition so quickly, so efficiently. A few phone calls. Mom's decided to move closer to family. She's doing great. I'll have her call you when she's settled. She never settled. By summer, Margaret had trouble remembering what month it was. The medication kept her floating just above consciousness, never fully awake, never fully asleep. She missed her garden. She missed the weight of real silverware, the taste of vegetables she'd grown herself, the satisfaction of a full day spent in purpose. She missed being a person instead of a problem to be managed. The nurse who noticed was named Simone, young, maybe late 20s, with box braids pulled back in a practical ponytail, and an efficiency that came from caring too much in a system that cared too little. She'd worked at Silverdale for 8 months and learned to spot the signs. The residents who were medicated into submission, the ones whose families visited less and less, the ones who'd had their agency slowly stripped away. Margaret caught her attention during medication rounds. Most residents took their pills automatically, mouths open like baby birds. But Margaret had started palming hers, hiding them under her tongue, spitting them into tissues when no one watched. She was trying to wake up. Simone found the cache of pills wrapped in Kleenex at the bottom of Margaret's small wastebasket. Instead of reporting it, she sat down on the edge of the plastic-covered bed. She said, "Talk to me," she said quietly. "Tell me what's happening here." And Margaret, with a clarity she hadn't felt in months, did. It took 3 weeks of Simone working extra shifts, timing her visits to Margaret's room when other staff were occupied. 3 weeks of carefully reducing medication errors, of documenting everything, and Margaret's mind slowly clearing like fog burning off under a determined sun. The picture that emerged was ugly. Rebecca and Derek had systematically isolated Margaret, manipulated her into signing everything away, then warehoused her in the cheapest facility they could find while they liquidated her assets. The house was already on the market. The investment accounts had been drained into offshore holdings. The rental property sold. Simone's brother was a paralegal. He connected Margaret with an attorney who specialized in elder financial abuse, a sharp woman named Patricia Lim, who took one look at the case and cleared her schedule. The legal terminology was complex, but the situation wasn't. Undue influence, financial exploitation, possible fraud in the power of attorney execution. Patricia could get everything back. She could get justice. She could make Rebecca and Derek pay. Margaret, sitting in Patricia's downtown office in clothes that finally fit properly again, her mind finally clear, considered her options. She thought about revenge, about standing in a courtroom watching her daughter's face as the judgment came down, about reclaiming every penny, every property, every piece of the life they'd stolen. She thought about it for exactly 3 minutes. Then she said, "No." Patricia blinked. "I'm sorry?" "I want my assets back." Her voice was steady now, stronger than it had been in months. "I want control of my own life, but I don't want to prosecute. I want a clean separation, legally ironclad. Rebecca gets nothing more from me, but she doesn't go to prison." "Miss Chen, what they did—" "I know what they did." Margaret folded her hands in her lap. The tremor was still there, but slight, manageable. "I know what I'm choosing. I could spend the next years of my life in litigation, in anger, in making them suffer the way they made me suffer. Or I could spend it doing something else." "What else?" She looked out the window at Portland's skyline, at the green hills beyond, at the late summer light turning everything golden. "I want to go home," she said. "Not to that house, somewhere else, somewhere I should have been all along." Margaret had grown up in Cedar Falls, a town of 4,000 people tucked into the foothills of the Cascade Range. She'd left at 18 for college, came back only for holidays and funerals. Her parents were buried there. Her high school friends had mostly stayed, raising families in the same houses they'd grown up in. She hadn't thought about Cedar Falls in decades, but as she drove the 2 hours south from Portland in a rental car, Patricia had recovered enough assets within 6 weeks to give Margaret immediate access to funds. She felt something unfurl in her chest. Recognition, not of the place which had changed, but of herself. The version of herself she'd been before marriage, before motherhood, before becoming someone whose worth was measured in how useful she was to others. Cedar Falls still had a main street, still had a diner called Nancy's where the coffee was too strong and the pie was perfect. Still had fields at the edge of town where nothing had been built because the soil was rocky and the view was too good to waste on strip malls. Margaret bought 20 acres of that land, paid cash, started drawing plans on graph paper at Nancy's counter while the waitress refilled her coffee and asked questions about what she was building. She said, "A garden, a big one, with a community center and housing for people who need a second chance." The waitress, whose name tag read Ruth and remembered Margaret from high school, smiled. "We could use something like that." By October, construction had started, not of buildings first, but of the garden itself. She hired a landscape architect who specialized in permaculture and regenerative design, a young woman named Esperanza who understood that gardens weren't just about plants, they were about people. They tilled raised beds in wide rows, planted fruit trees, apple, pear, cherry, that would take years to mature but would feed people for decades, installed a greenhouse for round-year growing, created pathways wide enough for wheelchairs and walkers. Margaret worked alongside the crew most days, not heavy lifting, but planning, planting, her hands in the soil again for the first time in over a year. The tremor in her hands eased, the fog in her mind already clearing dissipated entirely. She slept hard, woke early, felt purpose flowing back into her like water into a dry creek bed. The community center came next, a timber-framed building with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden. Inside, a commercial kitchen for canning and preserving classes, a library, a classroom with long tables for workshops, a children's area, because gardens were for everyone. And behind it, 6 small cottages, each with a bedroom, bathroom, kitchenette. Simple, dignified, private. Margaret hired a contractor from town who worked slowly and well. She insisted on paying above market rate and on time. She wanted this place built on integrity, even if it cost more and took longer. By the time the first snow fell, the bones were in place. Margaret didn't advertise for employees in the traditional sense. She reached out through networks she discovered through support groups for elder abuse survivors, reentry programs for formerly incarcerated people, community organizations serving people recovering from exploitation. She needed a site manager, a maintenance supervisor, workshop instructors, administrative help. What she wanted were people who understood what it meant to start over. The first person she hired was named Vivian, 67, former accountant who'd been financially abused by a nephew who'd convinced her to invest in fake ventures. She'd lost her home, her savings, her confidence. Now she managed the center's books with a meticulousness born from betrayal. The site manager was Marcus, 42, had spent 6 years in prison for a drug offense he'd committed in his 20s during the worst period of his addiction. He'd been clean for a decade now, worked his way up through landscaping companies, dreamed of running his own operation someday. At the garden, he oversaw everything from irrigation to education programs, teaching teenagers from Cedar Falls High how to build compost systems and repair equipment. The workshop coordinator was Lily, 38, former teacher who'd been in a relationship with a man who'd controlled every aspect of her life, her money, her friendships, her career. She'd escaped with nothing, but had slowly rebuilt herself through community college classes and volunteer work. Now she designed curriculum for the garden's education programs, everything from basic vegetable gardening to food preservation to financial literacy. Margaret didn't hire them despite their pasts. She hired them because of what they'd survived and what they'd learned. They understood the people who would come here. The Cedar Falls Community Garden and Learning Center opened on a Saturday in late April. The fruit trees were in bloom, clouds of white and pink petals against an impossibly blue sky. The raised beds were planted with early spring vegetables, lettuce, peas, radishes, spinach. The greenhouse hummed with seedlings waiting to be transplanted. Over 300 people showed up. Families from town, curiosity seekers, a reporter from the regional paper, a few city council members, and a bus full of seniors from a care facility 2 towns over, residents who'd heard about the project and wanted to see it themselves. Margaret stood on the porch of the community center, looking out at the crowd, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not pride exactly, more like rightness. Like she'd finally found a path she was supposed to be on all along. She didn't make a speech. Instead, she invited everyone into the garden. "Everything here," she said simply, "is for sharing. The food, the knowledge, the space. Come as you are, learn what you want to learn, teach what you know. This place belongs to all of us. They came, week after week, month after month, elderly people from nearby towns who wanted to garden but couldn't manage their own yards anymore, young families teaching their children where food came from, teenagers fulfilling community service hours who discovered they actually liked the work, veterans dealing with PTSD who found peace in repetitive tasks and living things, women leaving bad situations who needed somewhere safe to exhale. The center became what Margaret had envisioned, not a charity, but a commons, a place where people contributed what they could and took what they needed, and the balance somehow always worked out. By the second year, Margaret started noticing a pattern. People who'd been coming regularly to garden, to take classes, to volunteer, started asking questions. How had she funded this? How did the operational model work? Could something like this be replicated in other communities? She started hosting quarterly workshops specifically about the center itself. The legal structure, she'd set it up as a nonprofit with a community board. The funding, she'd endowed it with enough money to operate for 20 years without outside donations, though they accepted grants and contributions. The philosophy, that healing happened through purpose, that dignity came from contribution, that isolation was a symptom, not a solution. Women came from all over the Pacific Northwest, from struggling rural communities, from suburbs where people lived side by side but barely knew each other, from small cities losing their young people to urban migration. They took notes, asked about budgets and land acquisition and zoning regulations and volunteer coordination. Margaret answered everything, held nothing back. This wasn't proprietary knowledge. This was a blueprint for something the world needed more of. Rebecca appeared in late October of the third year. Margaret was in the greenhouse transplanting winter lettuce when Marcus came to find her, his expression carefully neutral. "Someone here to see you, says she's family." Margaret's hand stilled in the soil. She'd known this moment would come eventually, had imagined it in dozens of variations, what she'd say, how she'd feel, whether she'd be angry or calm or something else entirely. Margaret rinsed her hands at the outdoor sink, dried them on her work jeans, walked to the parking lot where Rebecca stood beside a rental car, looking diminished in the way people do when they're carrying shame. She looked older, thinner. The confidence that had armored her during the theft was gone, replaced by something tentative and raw. "Mom," she said. Just that. Nothing else seemed adequate. Margaret waited. Not out of cruelty, but because she'd learned that silence often held more wisdom than words. "I saw an article," Rebecca continued, gesturing vaguely toward the garden, "about this place, about what you're doing. I didn't know you were here, that you were—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "Thriving?" Margaret offered, not unkindly. Rebecca flinched. "Derek and I separated. The divorce is almost final. Everything fell apart after—" She couldn't say it, couldn't name what they'd done. "After you stole my life," Margaret said quietly. Rebecca's face crumpled. "Yes." They talked for 2 hours, not in the center. Margaret didn't want that space contaminated by this conversation. They walked the perimeter of the property instead, following the fence line through fields going dormant for winter. Rebecca cried, apologized, explained that Derek had convinced Margaret was losing her faculties, that they needed to protect her, that it all seemed reasonable at the time, until it became something else entirely and she couldn't see a way back. Margaret listened, didn't interrupt, let her daughter excavate her justifications and rationalizations and excuses. When Rebecca finally fell silent, Margaret said, "I forgive you." Rebecca's head snapped up. "What?" "I forgive you. Not because what you did was acceptable, it wasn't. Not because you've earned it, you haven't. but because I've built a life I love, and holding on to anger would poison it. So I forgive you, for me, not for you." Rebecca's relief was palpable, premature. "Then we can—" "No," Margaret said firmly. "Forgiveness isn't reconciliation, it's release. I forgive you, but I don't trust you. I may never trust you again. You're welcome to visit the center as a member of the public. You can volunteer if you follow the same rules as everyone else, but you're not welcome in my personal life. You're not welcome in my home. You lost that." "Mom," "I'm setting a boundary, Rebecca, not out of punishment, but out of self-preservation. You hurt me profoundly. You exploited my love. That doesn't mean I wish you harm. It means I'm protecting myself from further harm." Rebecca looked like she wanted to argue, to plead, to promise she'd changed, but something in Margaret's expression, calm, resolved, unshakable, stopped her. Can I come back to volunteer? If you're genuinely interested in the work, yes. If you're trying to earn your way back into my life, no. I'll know the difference." Rebecca did come back, every few months at first, then more regularly. She worked in the garden, helped with fall harvest, assisted Lily with children's workshops. She didn't try to force private conversations with Margaret, didn't push for more than Margaret offered. Slowly, incrementally, something like cautious connection developed, not mother and daughter as they'd been, not even mother and daughter as they could have been, but two women who shared history and were learning to share space without expectation. Margaret watched her daughter with the clear eyes of someone who'd survived the worst and chosen growth over bitterness. She saw Rebecca struggling with her own guilt, working through it in therapy, trying to become someone she could live with. Margaret offered encouragement when it was genuine, maintained distance when necessary, modeled what it looked like to be whole without needing anyone else to complete her. By the 5th year, 12 similar centers had opened across the country. By the 7th, 23. Margaret consulted on most of them, traveled to small towns in Montana and Vermont and New Mexico and Alabama, helped other women, because they were mostly women, navigate land acquisition and nonprofit structure and community buy-in. She spoke at conferences, not about her own story, that remained private, known only to those closest to the center, but about the model, about the research showing that purposeful activity and community connection were more effective than medication for many forms of depression and anxiety, about the economic benefits of intergenerational spaces, about the healing power of dirt under your fingernails and food you grew yourself. The women who came to learn from Margaret ranged from mid-20s to late 70s. Some had money, some had nothing but determination and a vision. Margaret helped them all. She taught them that starting wasn't about having perfect answers, it was about taking the first step and being willing to adjust. That community buy-in came from listening more than talking. That the most important resource wasn't money, it was genuine respect for the people you were trying to serve. One woman, Carmen, from a small town in southern Texas, arrived with a plan to create a garden specifically for women recovering from domestic violence. She had no land, minimal savings, and a fire in her eyes that reminded Margaret of herself. They spent a week together at the Cedar Falls Center. Margaret introduced her to local funders, shared her legal documents, connected her with architects who donate initial designs, taught her how to build a board of directors that would support rather than control. "Why are you doing this?" Carmen asked on her last evening. "You don't know me. I can't pay you." Margaret smiled. "Someone helped me when I needed it. A nurse who didn't have to care but did, an attorney who saw injustice and chose to fight it, a contractor who built something beautiful because he believed in the vision. This is how we survive, by helping each other survive." Carmen's center opened 2 years later. Margaret attended the opening and met a dozen women who had already found refuge there. Women who were learning to grow food and heal trauma simultaneously. Women who were rebuilding lives one tomato plant at a time. The model evolved. Some centers added workshops on financial literacy and legal rights for abuse survivors. Others partnered with local schools to provide youth education programs. A few incorporated art therapy or music or wilderness programs. Margaret encouraged every variation. This wasn't about replication, it was about adaptation. Each community had different needs, different resources, different strengths. The Cedar Falls Center added a small library focusing on memoirs and recovery literature. A partnership with a nearby university brought research interns who studied the impacts of the programs. Lower depression and anxiety scores, increased social connection, improved nutrition, decreased isolation among elderly participants. The data validated what Margaret had always known. People didn't just need food or housing or services, they needed purpose. They needed to be needed. They needed to know their contribution mattered. The center started hosting an annual gathering, people from all the affiliated gardens coming together to share successes, troubleshoot challenges, celebrate growth. It happened every August, and Margaret found herself surrounded by hundreds of people who had taken her blueprint and made it their own. She was 79 by then, moving slower, delegating more, but still showing up every day to the garden, still teaching workshops, still answering emails from strangers who'd heard about the project and wondered if they could do something similar in their community. On quiet mornings, when Margaret arrived at the center before anyone else, she sometimes thought about the house in Portland, the craftsman with the wraparound porch, the creek, the life she'd built with her husband. She didn't miss it. That surprised her initially, but it made sense. That house had been a container for a particular version of herself: wife, mother, homeowner, volunteer. All roles defined by relation to others. This place was different. Here she was Margaret, fully herself, defined by what she created, not by what others needed from her. She thought about Rebecca sometimes, too. Her daughter came more regularly now, almost monthly. They were cordial, sometimes warm, never fully repaired, but no longer broken in ways that needed constant tending. Rebecca had remarried, a quiet man who worked in solar panel installation and treated her with consideration Margaret hadn't seen in Derek. They lived modestly. Rebecca worked as a bookkeeper for a small nonprofit. She was, by all appearances, trying to be someone better than who she'd been. Margaret appreciated that without needing to validate it. Rebecca's redemption was Rebecca's work, not Margaret's responsibility. Margaret kept a file of letters. Not many. She wasn't sentimental about most things, but these she saved. Letters from women who'd visited the center, learned the model, started their own projects. Judith in Spokane reporting that her mental health garden had just celebrated 5 years and was expanding to include housing for people transitioning out of psychiatric facilities. Carmen in Texas sharing that 3 women from her center had gone on to start their own gardens in nearby towns, creating a network of healing spaces across the Rio Grande Valley. A woman named Helen in rural Maine describing how her garden had become a meeting place for elderly lobster fishermen who'd been isolated after retirement, giving them purpose and community again. A collective of young women in Detroit who transformed 6 vacant lots into urban farms that fed their neighborhood and employed formerly incarcerated women. Each letter was a ripple, a proof that one person choosing growth over revenge could create cascading change. Margaret didn't keep the letters out of pride. She kept them as evidence that the world could be different, that systems of care could exist outside institutions, that people, given dignity and opportunity and soil to work with, could heal themselves and each other. On Margaret's 80th birthday, the Cedar Falls Center held a celebration. Not for her, she'd resisted that, but for the network. Representatives of 43 gardens across the country came. They planted a circle of trees in the center of the property, one for each project, a living memorial to shared vision. Rebecca was there. She'd flown in without asking if she could come, but she stayed in the background, helped with setup, didn't try to position herself as family. Margaret appreciated that. The boundary respecting was its own form of growth. During the ceremony, people shared stories. A teenager from the local high school who'd discovered a passion for agriculture through the center and was now studying sustainable farming at Oregon State. An elderly woman who'd been suicidal after her husband's death but found reasons to keep living when she started volunteering. A veteran who'd been sober for 3 years and attributed his recovery to the quiet, purposeful work of the garden. Margaret listened from a folding chair in the shade. Her hands were more arthritic now, the tremor permanent, but her mind was sharp and her heart was full in ways she'd never imagined possible. When it was her turn to speak, she kept it brief. "I didn't build this place," she said. "We all did. Every person who planted a seed, every person who shared knowledge, every person who chose to be here, you built it. And you'll keep building it long after I'm gone. That's the point. This isn't about one person. It's about what happens when we decide to care for each other, when we decide that healing isn't something done to us, but something we do together." Margaret stepped back from daily operations at 82, not from a decline in health, but from a recognition that leadership needed to rotate. She built the structure. Now it was time for others to shape its future. Vivian took over as executive director, Marcus as operations lead, Lily as program director. Together, they ran the center with the same values Margaret had instilled, but with their own innovations, their own visions for growth. Margaret moved into one of the small cottages on the property, not because she needed care, but because she wanted to be close to the work. She woke to the sound of birds and the fruit trees she'd planted a decade earlier, walked the garden paths every morning, taught occasional workshops when she felt up to it. She wrote a book, not a memoir, those were self-indulgent, she thought, but a practical guide for starting community healing centers. She donated all proceeds to a fund that provided startup grants for new projects. She mentored a new generation of women remotely via video calls and email, answering questions about land trusts and volunteer management and how to navigate zoning boards and how to measure impact without losing sight of purpose. She watched the network grow to 60 centers, then 75, then 90. Rebecca asked to talk privately one afternoon in late spring. Margaret agreed. They sat on Margaret's small porch overlooking the garden. Early vegetables were coming up. The fruit trees were heavy with young fruit. "I've been offered a job," Rebecca said, "managing finances for a network of domestic violence shelters. It's in Sacramento. I'd be moving." "Congratulations," Margaret said. She meant it. "I wanted you to know before I accepted, in case—" Rebecca trailed off. "In case I needed you?" Margaret smiled gently. "I don't need you, Rebecca. I love you, I forgive you, but I don't need you. That's actually a compliment. It means I'm whole on my own." Rebecca nodded slowly. "I've been in therapy for 6 years now, working through what I did, why I did it. My therapist says I'm still trying to earn your absolution." "And what do you think?" "I think she's right. I think I want you to tell me I'm forgiven in a way that erases what happened, but you can't do that. No one can." "No," Margaret agreed. "I can't. What happened, happened. You can't undo it. You can only decide who you want to be going forward." "I'm trying to be someone who helps instead of harms," Rebecca said quietly. "The job, It feels the right kind of work, using what I know about finance to protect vulnerable people instead of exploiting them. Margaret reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand, brief, warm, then let go. Then you should take it, not for me, for yourself, and for the people you'll help. Rebecca left 2 weeks later. They hugged goodbye in the parking lot. It wasn't the embrace of a mother and daughter who'd never been broken. It was the embrace of two women who'd heard each other, done the work, and found a way to exist in each other's orbit without causing further damage. That felt like enough. Margaret's health began declining in her 84th year. Nothing dramatic, just the slow erosion that comes with age. Her knees protested stairs, her energy flagged by early afternoon. The arthritis in her hands made it harder to work in the soil she loved. But her mind stayed sharp, and her commitment to the work never wavered. She continued mentoring. A woman from rural Kentucky spent a month at the center, learning the model, asking questions, dreaming big. A collective from a native reservation in Montana visited for a week, exploring how to integrate traditional plant knowledge with the community garden framework. A group of social work students from Portland State came regularly, studying the center as a model for trauma-informed community design. Margaret met with all of them, shared everything she knew, held nothing back. One student, a young woman named Amara, who was writing her thesis on intergenerational healing spaces, asked Margaret what she was most proud of. Margaret thought for a long moment, watching people work in the garden through her cottage window, a grandmother teaching her grandson how to tie tomato plants, a man in his 50s, recently widowed, laughing with Marcus about proper pruning techniques, a teenage girl with purple hair carefully transplanting seedlings while listening to music through earbuds. "I'm proud that this place doesn't need me anymore," Margaret said finally. "I'm proud that it will go on, that the model is spreading, that people are taking this idea and making it their own. That's what legacy actually is, not what you hold on to, but what you release into the world." The Fall Harvest Festival in Margaret's 85th year was the largest yet. Over 1,000 people came, families from Cedar Falls and surrounding towns, representatives from over 100 community gardens that had used the Cedar Falls model or been inspired by it, journalists, documentary filmmakers, academic researchers, policymakers studying alternative models for senior care and community wellness. Margaret watched from a comfortable chair under the pergola Marcus had built. She wore a sweater despite the warm September sun, her body struggling with temperature regulation now. But her eyes were bright, taking it all in. Children ran through the paths, volunteers loaded boxes with produce for the local food bank, musicians played bluegrass on the porch of the community center. The smell of apple pie, made from fruit from the trees Margaret had planted her first year, drifted from the kitchen. Vivian approached with a microphone. "People want to hear from you." "I don't need to hear from them. They're living it." "They want to say thank you." Margaret sighed but smiled, accepted the microphone, waited for the crowd to quiet. "I'm going to tell you a secret," she said, her voice still strong if only her body wasn't. "I started this place when I was angry, hurt, betrayed by people I trusted. I had every reason to spend my remaining years seeking revenge, making them pay, holding on to that pain like it could protect me from future harm." The crowd was absolutely silent now. But revenge is a closed loop. It gives you back exactly what was taken from you: pain, rage, isolation. It makes you smaller. I didn't want to be smaller. I wanted to be bigger, not in ego, but in impact. I wanted my pain to mean something beyond itself. She gestured to the garden, to the buildings, to the people gathered. "So I built this, not alone, never alone, with Simone, who saw me when I was invisible, with Patricia, who fought for my rights, with Vivian and Marcus and Louie and hundreds of others who believed that healing happens in community, not in isolation, with every person who's ever planted a seed here, or taught a class, or shared a meal, or just sat quietly and let the garden work its magic. Her voice softened. The people who hurt me taught me something valuable, even if they didn't mean to. They taught me that I was stronger than I knew, that I could lose everything and still build something beautiful, that the opposite of cruelty isn't revenge, it's creation. Margaret didn't make it to 86. She passed quietly in her sleep in a February night in her cottage, surrounded by books and photos and the gentle sound of rain on the roof. The memorial service was held in the community center. Over 1,500 people came. They stood shoulder to shoulder, spilled out onto the lawn despite the cold drizzle. Rebecca spoke. She didn't sugarcoat their history, didn't pretend their relationship had been simple or easy. She told the truth, that she'd hurt her mother profoundly, that Margaret had chosen grace over vengeance, and the gift of that choice had allowed Rebecca to become someone she could live with. My mother taught me that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means refusing to let someone else's worst moment define your future. She taught me that by living it, and because she lived it, I'm standing here today as someone who helps people instead of hurting them. That's her legacy in me. Vivian spoke about Margaret's vision and pragmatism. Marcus about her respect for dignity and labor, Lily about her fierce protection of the vulnerable and her unwillingness to accept that things had to be the way they'd always been. And then, one by one, dozens of others spoke, people whose lives had been changed by the center, women who'd started their own gardens in distant states, teenagers who'd found purpose, elderly people who'd found community, veterans who'd found peace. Each story was different. Each story was the same. Margaret had seen them, had believed they mattered, had created space for them to heal and grow and become. The Cedar Falls Community Garden and Learning Center continues, under new leadership but with the same values. The endowment Margaret created ensures it will operate for decades. The network of inspired gardens keeps expanding, 137 at last count, scattered across the country from rural Alaska to urban Miami, each one adapting the model to local needs, each one creating space for people to heal through purpose and connection. Rebecca visits twice a year. She brings flowers on her mother's birthday and sits in the garden, sometimes alone, sometimes with the quiet man she married who never met Margaret but respects the boundaries that were set. She volunteers in the greenhouse, doesn't try to claim special status, has learned, finally, that love means respecting what people need, not demanding what you want. The cottage where Margaret lived is used now for visiting mentors. Women who started their own centers come for sabbaticals, to rest and reflect and remember why they do this work. They leave notes in the journal Margaret started, reflections on the work, gratitude for the model, questions they're wrestling with, stories of small victories and persistent challenges. The journal is filling up, will need to be replaced soon. That feels right. The work continues, the conversation goes on. 10 years after Margaret's death, a researcher publishes a comprehensive study on community healing gardens. The Cedar Falls model is featured prominently. The data is striking: measurable improvements in mental health outcomes, reduced social isolation, increased food security, economic development in rural communities. Policymakers take notice, grants become available, the model that started with one woman's refusal to be destroyed by betrayal becomes recognized as a legitimate intervention for community wellness. But the real impact isn't in the data. It's in the grandmother in Montana teaching her granddaughter to can tomatoes using skills she learned at a garden modeled after Cedar Falls. It's in the veteran in Georgia who hasn't had a panic attack in 6 months because he spends his mornings tending raised beds alongside other veterans who understand. It's in the woman in Ohio who left an abusive marriage and rebuilt her life one pepper plant at a time, who now runs the garden that saved her and helps other women do the same. It's in the teenager in New Mexico who discovered he wanted to study agriculture because of a high school service project at a community garden, who's now working on sustainable farming methods that will feed his pueblo for generations. These stories don't mention Margaret's name. Most of these people never met her, but they're living her answer to the question she faced in Patricia's office that day. What do you do with your pain? You plant it, you water it, you tend it carefully, and you see what grows. Here's what Margaret understood that most people never learn. Revenge is easy. It's the default setting of human pain. Someone hurts you, you hurt them back, the scales balance, justice is served. Except they never balance. The scales never balance, because revenge requires you to stay connected to your pain, to preserve it carefully, to feed it and maintain it so it stays sharp enough to cut. Margaret chose something harder. She chose to let the pain transform into something else entirely, not to deny it or suppress it or pretend it didn't matter, but to use it as fuel for creation instead of destruction. She built gardens, plural, not just the physical space in Cedar Falls, but gardens in hundreds of hearts across the country. Places where people who'd been hurt could discover they were also powerful, where people who'd been diminished could expand, where people who'd been discarded could bloom. The people who hurt Margaret, her daughter, her son-in-law, they lost everything in the end anyway, not because Margaret destroyed them, but because their own choices hollowed them out from the inside. Derek disappeared into legal troubles and debt. Rebecca survived by completely rebuilding herself, a painful process that took years. Meanwhile, Margaret planted apple trees that will feed people for a century, trained caregivers who will protect thousands of vulnerable elders, created a model that will outlive her by generations. That's not weakness disguised as strength. That's power so complete it doesn't need to prove itself through domination. The last time Rebecca visited Cedar Falls, 3 years after her mother's death, she walked to the circle of trees planted on Margaret's 80th birthday. 137 trees now, one for every garden in the network. They'd grown, not towering yet, but established, root systems deepening, canopies expanding. In 20 years, they'd provide shade for gatherings. In 50 years, they'd be landmarks. In 100 years, no one would remember why they were planted, only that they were there, solid and giving. Rebecca stood in the center of the circle, closed her eyes, listened to wind moving through leaves that her mother would never see fully grown. And she understood finally what her mother tried to teach her. Legacy isn't what you take, it's what you leave behind that keeps growing after you're gone. Revenge would have given Margaret years of satisfaction watching people who hurt her suffer, but it would have ended with her death, a closed chapter, a finite story. This, the gardens, the network, the thousands of people whose lives were touched by a woman who chose healing over harm, this doesn't end. This keeps growing. Rebecca opened her eyes. A young couple was walking the garden paths with their toddler. An elderly man was teaching a workshop on seed saving in the community center. Vivian was consulting with a woman from Tennessee who wanted to start something similar in her town. Life, purpose, connection, growth. That's what her mother built with the ashes of her stolen life. That's what remains when you choose to be bigger than your pain.